So let's talk real quick before we get into Scrum about sort of what the alternatives tend to be, and the big one is really Waterfall. So this is Waterfall. Some of you may have seen this already. It looks like a bit like a waterfall. Each stage sort of flows into the next one, to the next one, to the next one. This is a pretty generic version of it. I'm trying to keep stuff that's pretty wide, so it's not just focused on games. Oh, real quick, if at any point you have questions, feel free to step into the Q&A spot and interrupt me. I'm happy to answer questions as they come up. Anyway, so this is what Waterfall looks like. Generally, the idea is you start by gathering your requirements. Then once you basically have those nailed down and figured out, then you flow into designing based on those requirements, trying to figure out, okay, how do we create an application or a feature or an update or whatever that solves the requirements that we were presented with. And then you lock in the design, and then you hand it off usually to another team and start implementing. Sometimes people are involved in both processes, but it usually tends to be come and go. And you start implementing, and you're implementing based on the design, and sometimes things go well, and sometimes things go not so well. But the problem with Waterfall tends to be that it's very static. Once a previous stage has been completed, you can't really go back. You can't get requirements changed. You can't get design changed. So it gets really expensive and really difficult to make to make changes as you need to as a result of the changing circumstances of game development. So by the time you get into verification, things tend to be a little bit screwy. And if you hear about games sort of coming together the last couple months, it's often because they're doing something like this. So I definitely understand why we came from a place of using Waterfall a lot, but it's not something that is useful for the majority of games. So this is a great chart that I really like to use, where it sort of talks about, generally there's two continuums that you want to work on, right? There's how well do you understand your requirements, and how well do you understand your technology. The more uncertain these things are, the less useful Waterfall tends to be. So for example, if you're working in a technology that's relatively new, something like AR, VR, or just XR general stuff, or like people who are doing blockchain games, whatever the hell those are, there's a lot of uncertainty with a lot of those technologies. So you're at a point right now where trying to work in a very static model is going to be really difficult for you. You're not going to have the flexibility you need to figure stuff out. Similarly, if your requirements are sort of up in the air, and since games tend to be a technology with a lot of uncertain requirements as you go along, you're going to have issues using Waterfall. So, for example, if you start a game and you're making a shooter, but you realize that the part that's actually the most fun is the card game you've built to go alongside of it, well, if you've committed to the shooter, you're kind of committed to the shooter. But if you're not using a waterfall model, then there's an opportunity for you to pivot and say, okay, hey, let's put aside all the shooter stuff. Let's focus on the stuff that's working. Let's focus on the card game. If you look at applications like Slack, for example, Slack and Discord, both of them started out as video games, and they built this chat app, and they found that the chat app worked a lot better than the stuff that they were doing, so they pivoted. And if they were sticking truly to a waterfall model, they wouldn't be able to pivot because the requirements up front involved creating a game. Whereas in something like Scrum or Kanban, your requirements are much more fungible. So let's talk about Agile. We're going to start with the Agile Manifesto. I'll highlight a few of the pieces there. So the first note in the Agile Manifesto is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So the idea here is pretty straightforward. Our processes and our tools are important, but they're not as important as the people who are on our teams and having communication among those people. So if our processes are preventing people who need to talk to one another from talking to one another, then it's our process that needs to change. If our tools are preventing people from having the conversations, if they're hurting the work of people that are involved, then it's the tools that need to change, not the individuals. We always need to prioritize having people and the interactions between those people over the tools and the processes that we developed. And if those things are not serving the people, then we need to change them. Secondly, working software over comprehensive documentation. Our players don't give a shit how good our design docs are. They don't, and they won't, and they really shouldn't, right? The only thing that players care about at the end of the day is, what can I play? What can I enjoy? What can I spend my time with? So it doesn't matter how good our documentation is at the end of the day if it doesn't lead to working actual software. And so Agile similarly prioritizes, we want to make sure that we have stuff that works over something that is completely documented. That doesn't mean you don't ever want to document. That doesn't mean that we can't ever document clearly or effectively. But if we have a choice between, okay, we can get this thing out the door and we can get into players' hands, or we can make a design doc for this thing, we should always prioritize making the thing itself. Third, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. There will be times where we will make promises to our players or we'll make promises to our stakeholders. And we don't want to get into a situation where we are negotiating the terms of those promises. We don't want to say, well, we promised you 3 things and we gave you 3 things, even if they weren't the 3 things that you wanted. We want to get into a state where we are collaborating with our stakeholders, with our players, with our partners, as opposed to negotiating with them. Because when we're collaborating it with them, we're focusing on the same problems, we're approaching them from the same side, and we're trying to solve them together. And we're going to be a lot more successful and a lot more useful, and everyone's going to feel a hell of a lot better than if we're negotiating over where commas should be. And fourth, Agile, why it's called Agile. Responding to change over following a plan. Plans are great. I'm a producer. I spend a lot of time thinking about plans. But a plan is only as good as the reality of trying to execute it. And as soon as reality shifts, as it inevitably will, we need to be able to respond. I use Slack and Discord as examples. Once they realized that the games that they were working on weren't as good or as interesting as the chat apps that they were building, they responded to that and shifted what their plan was. And it sucks, you work a lot on plans, you really want them to come through, but a plan is only as good as what our goals are to achieve it. And if the reality of hitting our goals has shifted because of some external or internal force, it's no good continuing to go down that path of trying to execute on that plan when it's no longer relevant. So there's the primary 4 pieces of Agile in the Agile Manifesto. So let's talk real quick about Scrum. This is basically all of it. This is Scrum on a slide. I'm going to go in detail about this, but we're going to circle back to this. You're going to see a lot of the stuff over again. So let's start with grooming the product backlog. So let's address the meme real quick. So I'm sure people saw this meme. This was going around social media recently. It made me sad. I understood where it's coming from, but this is generally assigned to me of an unhealthy process. So let's talk about what a healthy process can look like. So in an ideal world, we have a product backlog, which is everything that we ever want to do with this thing, this game, with this update, with this feature, whatever the hell it is. We put it in this backlog, and we have a product owner who orders it from the most important stuff at the top to the least important stuff at the bottom. And as we complete stuff from the top, stuff rises up to the top, and we complete that over time. Obviously, some stuff will come in and get slotted appropriately. Sometimes ideas will come in at the bottom. Sometimes they'll come in at the top, and we'll have to respond appropriately to that. But we need to be grooming that backlog, and we want to make sure that the stuff that it's at the top is at a size that can be done within a sprint. If that stuff is not something that can be accomplished within a sprint, we're going to have a lot of problems with it. So that's why you can see, hopefully my mouse shows up. You can see here at the top, we've got a much smaller grouping of things than at the bottom here, where these are basically ideas that we had, like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had multiplayer? Or, hey, at some point we're gonna need to do achievements, or, we need a settings menu. Where at the top here, it's like, okay, let's add this very specific touch here, or, we have to polish, the graphics on level 3 kind of stuff. Like, these are much more focused, contained, specific things that are accomplishable. And then we take that product backlog and we take that to refinement. And refinement is where the product owner meets with the team and they sit down and they talk about the tickets. And I generally recommend starting at the top and working your way down and saying, okay, do we understand what the work is? Do we understand what the problem that we're trying to solve is? We don't need to figure out how we're going to solve the problem immediately. We don't need to know, okay, we need this person to build this thing and this person to build this other thing, and then we have to go talk to so and yada yada. We just need to understand: do we get the problem that is that our product owner is asking us to solve? And if we don't, then this is an opportunity for us to ask questions as the team of the product owner, understand, oh, hey, did you mean that you wanted it do you want this to be solved, or did you mean this other piece? What's included in this? What's not included in this, etc. The goal here is for the team to get to a point where they understand what the expectations of these tickets are, so that they can then take them in at some point in sprint planning, which we'll get to in a moment, and start on them immediately. It doesn't mean that they won't ever have questions again. It doesn't mean that things won't take longer or different amounts of depending. It doesn't mean that they can't figure out like who are the general people that might be involved and have input on this sort of thing. But it does mean that they understand at the very basic idea of what are the problems that they're being asked to resolve, and that's the important aspect. So then once the tickets are refined, we can take them into sprint planning. So sprint planning for me is always pretty simple and straightforward. Um, in Scrum, everything is a volunteer effort. I don't go and tell people what to do. The product owner doesn't go in and tell people what to do. We ask people to just to look at the work at the top of the list and say, okay, this is the most important thing. Who can do this work? And if anyone can do it, they have the opportunity to volunteer. If someone specifically wants to do it, they can, of course, volunteer themselves. The team can discuss amongst themselves, whatever. But we keep doing that until either everybody decides, hey, I can't do any more work, or we finish the backlog, right? Those are the only two exit conditions for sprint planning. And people decide for themselves when is too much. So at any point, someone on the team can say, you know what, I've taken in, these 3 tickets. I think that's as much as I'm going to be able to get done this sprint, and that's fine, right? It's not the Scrum Master's job. It's not the product owner's job to jump in and say, well, I think you can really do a 4th one. We have to trust the team estimates, and so when the team is done with planning the sprint, that's what it is. Now, importantly, this is the team making a promise that they are going to deliver the work that they have taken in over the course of the sprint. So by the end of the sprint, all of that work should be presentable to the product owner in whatever fashion has been agreed upon based on refinement. And if the team doesn't feel comfortable with that, this is the opportunity to speak up and say, hey, like we should talk about this. I think maybe I took on too much. And it doesn't mean that commitment can't change. If there are factors that cause work to change, that's acceptable. But we need to have that conversation because right now, up front, the team is making the commitment. So after we get out of sprint planning, we start the sprint. Sprints can be variable time, usually between 1 and 4 weeks, usually having a specific like 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, just because it's a little bit cleaner and simpler. And the goal is that at the end of the sprint, all of the work that was committed in sprint planning, the team will deliver to the product owner. So the product owner can evaluate and decide whether or not it meets their specifications. So we have a daily scrum every day. It's also known as a stand-up. Idea there, I think we've all experienced this probably at this point, but just to reiterate, we meet generally for less than 15 minutes every day. Everyone ideally is standing up, though that's a little bit trickier these days with everyone being remote. And we go through and we talk about 3 things. We say, what did we do yesterday? What are we doing today? And what are, if any, are we blocked on? And it's important, those first 2 questions, I think that there's a misconception oftentimes where people think that they're answering those things for the product owner or the Scrum Master. And it's nice for the product owner and Scrum Master to know those things. But actually, that's what those things that they're telling are for their fellow team members, right? Because it's the team that makes the commitment to the product owner. And this daily Scrum is a check-in for everyone to say, hey, am I making progress towards the goal, towards the commitment that I made? And if they're not, that's an opportunity for them to either ask for help or for someone else on the team to jump in and say, hey, you've been saying that you've been working on this thing for a couple of days now. Do you need some support with that? Do you need some help with that? That is a thing that takes a lot of time for teams to get to. Some teams are more mature about that kind of thing than others. And that's the Scrum Master's role to help the team get to that point. But that's really what those first 2 questions are for. The third one is also for the team, but also the Scrum Master can support and help with blockages. So we're doing that every day over the course of our, between 1 to 4 weeks. And at the end of it, we have our sprint review. Every sprint should end with a sprint review. And the goal of the sprint review is it's basically a demo. Everybody should show off the work that they completed and only work that they completed. Anything that is in progress, anything that wasn't finished by the standards of the team and the standards of the product owner does not get demoed. Only the stuff that was completed. But ideally, everything should be, and it should be demoed, not like, hey, let me show you what it should look like, but here's all the actual work that I completed. Ideally, as much of it, in engine, in game as possible. Some things obviously aren't going to fit that way, right? If you're doing some back end work or you were working in a design doc or whatever, that kind of stuff, you might need to show off those pieces. But you shouldn't be showing off like, hey, like here are my notes about how this thing would work in game if I'd spent time implementing it, as opposed to what I ended up doing. Importantly, the sprint review is for the product owner, but that doesn't mean that other people can't attend. I really encourage folks to bring in people from outside the team, just within the studio, to sit there and chime in and give feedback, because it's really helpful to have that range of opinion from people who aren't as close to the product, the feature, whatever, as the team is. But at the end of the sprint review, the product owner basically gets an opportunity to decide will they accept or reject the sprint. And this is practically speaking more of like a tone thing than anything else. The product, just because the product owner rejects a sprint doesn't mean that the work gets thrown out and we do everything over again. What it means though is that the product owner is if the product owner rejects a sprint, it means that they're unhappy with the delivery of the team. It could be because the team promised that they would deliver a lot more than they did. And so the product owner is saying, hey, you promised me all of this stuff and you gave me this little piece. What happened, right? What happened to all this other stuff that I was promised? It could be that the product owner is saying, hey, like you delivered a bunch of stuff to me, but it didn't have anything to do with the stuff that we talked about in refinement and sprint planning. What happened there, right? Um, and that's important for the product owner to give that feedback back to the team so the team understands, are they trending in the right direction or are they trending the wrong direction? And that leads us to the next thing, which is the sprint retro. So Agile is a process around iteration and improvement, not just within our product, but also within our team. And the sprint retrospective is our opportunity to meet it for the team to meet as a group and to talk about how things went in the previous sprint and figure out how can we improve our process so that it works better for us. So if the product owner has just rejected a sprint, that's a pretty good sign to the team. Hey, something's not working. We need to figure out what's not working and try different approaches. Now, importantly, just because you're bringing something up in a sprint retrospective and asking to make a change does not mean that that change is necessarily going to be the right one. We don't know ahead of time necessarily what the best approach is going to be. So the important aspect here is that we want to try different things every sprint retro to resolve a problem until that problem is resolved or there's more important things to think about. So we want to encourage the team to brainstorm and think about different ways that they could solve that problem. It could be we want to have stricter approval processes within the team, or we want to have more explicit handoffs, or we want to have less explicit handoffs, or whatever. We need more clarity around X, Y, or Z. The team gets to come up with different approaches. The team gets to come up with different solutions, and then the Scrum Master's role is to facilitate that conversation and then help the team drive that change. That doesn't mean that the Scrum Master will jump in and say, okay, you folks said you're going to do less explicit stuff. I will now come up with what the new less explicit format is going to be. No, that's the team's job. The team is owning their process. The Scrum Master there is to facilitate it and help them make that thing, but it is not to do it for them. To use a popular aphorism, your job as a Scrum Master is not to fish for people. It is to teach people how to fish for themselves. But sometimes sprint retros go really well. Things that the sprint wasn't rejected, the product owner's happy, the team is happy. There's things to work through, obviously, all the time to make improvements, but generally things are okay. And at the end of it, we come out with the new increment or new feature. So after the goal with the sprint is that at the end of each sprint, we have something that we can now deliver to our players, right? We want to have working software over comprehensive documentation. And so we can then release whatever the new stuff is so that our players have new stuff to play with and they get excited by the new cool things that we just gave them. And then we go right back to the beginning and do this whole cycle all over again. We go right back into sprint planning, figure out what the next stuff is, and we keep going through cycle after cycle until either the product isn't worth supporting, we've done all the work that the product could ever have, or I don't know, something else happens. So that's Scrum. That's all of it on one slide. I just flew through it. Still got some time left though, thankfully. So Scrum is a really good system compared to Waterfall when different things are fixed. So in Waterfall, your requirements are fixed, as we saw up front. But what's estimated is your resources and your time. Okay, we need to make a game that's going to be a shooter. It's going to have to go on the Xbox and it's going to have to go on the PlayStation, and we want it on the Switch. And then you go, okay, well, we think we're going to need 3 years to do that, and we're going to need 100 engineers and 200 whatevers. And then you hope that you're right. In Scrum, what's fixed up front is your resources and your time, right? Your time is your sprint that is fixed to however long between 1 and 4 weeks that you're going to do it. And your resources are fixed to your team. The team doesn't change within that sprint. What you're estimating instead are your requirements. What can we accomplish with the people that we have and the time that we have? And as a result, you're going to be much more consistent and effective at getting the things that you want than you are in a waterfall model because you are allowed to be a lot more flexible. It's important, though, that in this model that we're empowering the team and we're giving them accountability. I've talked about some ways of that, but the team decides what they can take on. And therefore, the team is accountable for the work that they take on. The team can say, hey, we don't think we can do any more than this stuff, but that means that they have to deliver the stuff that they say that they can deliver. That doesn't mean that the team is, it's a zero-sum game where if the team doesn't give you everything that they failed, but it means that if the team is worried that they're not going to make the commitment that they have promised, that they have to communicate with the Scrum Master and the product owner and say, hey, we thought we were going to do X, we can't do X because Y came up, or one of the things that we picked out is just much bigger than we realized, and so we need to have a conversation and reprioritize it and understand, is this still as important to the product owner as it is. Sometimes it will be, and sometimes that'll lead to bad sprints, but sometimes the product owner will say, yeah, that totally makes sense, we didn't consider that stuff because this is blown out in scope, we don't need this, it's not as important anymore, we can backlog that and come back to it later. That also means that sometimes the team is going to fail. Failure is really good. I know that it's really hard for a lot of folks to hear that because we're built to run so many processes where we can't fail, because if we fail, then everything falls apart and dies. And the promise that I tend to make as a Scrum Master is that I will never let the team fail in a catastrophic way. I will never let you fail in a way where the servers are going to get shut down and the game's going to collapse and we're all going to lose our jobs. But I'm going to let you fail in all sorts of other ways. I'm going to let you fail because you said that you could do more than you could actually do. I'm going to let you fail because you didn't have a conversation with the Scrum Master or the product owner that you needed to have. I'm going to let you fail because you thought an idea around a way that we could change the process was going to work, even though I was confident that it wasn't. I will let you fail in that way because failure is an amazing way to learn. And because without failure, there's no actual empowerment or accountability. If we don't let people fail, if we don't let people try things, then we're not actually giving them the power to make decisions. We're not holding them accountable for those decisions. We're just coming in, we're catching them, we're getting them out of the way, and we're just making all those decisions for them. Without failure, there is no empowerment, there is no accountability. And so failure is a key, important aspect of Scrum. So let's talk about quickly the 3 roles. I'm not going to do these super in depth, but just to talk about them in general. The product owner, important aspect is that they develop the product vision. They're a person, not a committee. So they have within their heads or within a document or whatever, they're the person that makes the decisions. And they decide on the product vision and the functionality. That doesn't mean that they're deciding on really small pieces of functionality. They're not figuring out like, oh, is this button blue or is it red or whatever, but high level stuff like, hey, like, are we going to have multiplayer? Are we going to have, what kind of accessibility support are we talking about doing? As part of that, they're also managing, collaborating, and facilitating with stakeholders across the business to make sure, hey, these people who need to know how these decisions are going to be impacted them are aware of that stuff. The way that they actually work with the team to manage that vision is that they prioritize the backlog. They're deciding what's the stuff that's the most important and is therefore at the top, and the stuff that is least important and at the bottom. Anyone can write user stories, but ultimately the product owner is accountable for them. They have to make sure that every user story, especially the ones at the top, are ones that they're comfortable and happy with. And as we said, they respect the team estimates and forecast. If the team says we can't do it, then the product owner has to respect that. They have to be part of the Scrum ceremonies, and they have to be available for the team so that the team can ask questions of them and get the answers that they need to move forward. The Scrum team is a team of equals. Generally, Scrum teams, you want them to be between 4 and 7, roughly speaking, but you can have bigger teams. I don't recommend too much bigger than that. I've done that before. It's very taxing. It's just the reality of the more people you have, the more potential communication points there are. And after a certain point, it becomes impractical for people to have all the conversations that they need to have. Teammates support one another. This is actually a team. And the goal is that the team is cross-functional, which means that more people can do more things, empowered, so the team can make their own decisions, and self-organized. The team runs the Scrum, for example. It's their meeting. The Scrum Master can facilitate it, but it's not their thing at the end of the day. We talked about it. They're forecasting the sprints, and therefore they're accountable for the delivery. They support the product owner during backlog grooming or refinement to make sure that they understand what the work is, and they plan that work and the dependencies within sprint planning. And they can identify impediments whether early or along the way. And co-located, obviously, that's not as possible with pandemic stuff, but as much as possible to facilitate face-to-face communication. Individuals' interactions, right? Like we want to make sure that people are actually talking to each other, communicating. And so we need to give them the opportunities to do so. If we can't co-locate, we have to come up with viable alternatives that allow people to actually keep talking to one another, or else we run into the same problems that we were trying to resolve. And finally, the Scrum Master. Scrum Master is a servant leader. They're not a project manager. I hate the project manager title. Whole other talk why I don't like that one. but Scrum Masters don't estimate and they don't commit to dates. I mean, I can create an estimate, but like it's going to be useless because at the end of the day, the team is the one who's deciding how much they're getting done in a reasonable amount of time. What the Scrum Master does do is they own the Scrum process. So that slide I showed earlier, that showed the whole thing on one slide. They own that process and they help the team understand that and help mature them along the Agile journey. They guard and support the team, so they protect the team from outside interference, make sure that the team isn't, getting inputs from folks that shouldn't be providing those inputs at those times, like the classic meddling executive trope, and facilitating team decision making. If the team's having a hard time making a decision about how to do something or who needs to do what, the Scrum Master is there to help have the conversation, figure out, okay, who can do this thing, who wants to do this thing, but they're not there to step in and say, so and so, you are doing this thing. And they help remove impediments. So when a problem comes up along the way, hey, we can't talk to this person in this other department, or we can't find out who we need to talk to at this outsource firm about this thing, the Scrum Master is there to help support the team and remove that impediment. And ultimately there to facilitate, especially sprint planning and the sprint retro. But should my game development process be agile? I have no idea. Agile is a really great methodology, and Scrum as a framework is an excellent framework, and I'm a huge fan of it. I've run it on a number of different games of varying sizes. I can tell you that right now, on Lord of the Rings Online, I am not planning to move us into Scrum in the short term, at least. I think eventually that is a healthy place for us to end up, but the way that things are set up right now, it would be too cost prohibitive to make it a reasonable approach. And that might be true for your team. Going back to the uncertainty, if things are more certain, both in terms of your technology and in terms of your requirements, you don't need something like Scrum. It's going to be too much work to have all these, it's the sprint planning and the sprint retro and the daily Scrums. They're just not going to be useful. And Waterfall might be perfectly adequate for your needs, but you need to evaluate your needs and understand, is this the right approach? And if it's not the right approach, making the switch. And that's all I got. I managed to make it with 3 minutes to spare. I'm happy to start talking about this stuff with any people. I'm planning to be in the lounge for a little bit of time. You're also more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm at Combrod with an underscore on Twitter. You can email me at ovbrodskiy, that's IY, @gmail.com. And I'm Oleg Brodskiy on LinkedIn. I guess I didn't properly introduce myself, so just mention it real quick. I'm currently the producer on Ascending Some Games for Lord of the Rings Online. But before that, I've worked in a variety of other places and worked on a ton of other games. So happy to talk about what your stuff might look like. If anyone has any questions, feel free to step into the Q&A spot. Otherwise, I'm set. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And now I'll take a drink. All right. Well, since you're all scared to go ask questions, I'll start. Oh, Greg's got a question. If you're talking, Greg, I can't hear you.
Check 1, 2.
There we go.
Okay. So one thing that seems relevant to my current work is how can you keep the product owner from constantly compromising mid-sprint on their requirements and the team's commitment?
Okay, so the product owner is compromising mid-sprint. What does that mean?
So the team says, we'll do A, B, and C. We commit to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then mid-sprint, it's like, oh, B is larger than we thought, and we don't know if we can deliver C because of that. And so like partway through the sprint, like a third to a half of the sprint gets like pulled out of the sprint and put on the backlog. And the product owner just seems like okay with that, but it means that like where we start a sprint and end a sprint are very different things.
What do you mean by where we start a sprint and where we end a sprint are different things?
Like we say we're going to do A, B, and C, and we end up with like A and maybe some research on B, and C gets thrown out, and then also to some degree like, oh, but because those things got thrown out, D is in there. And so all of a sudden, like it's been 2 weeks and
halfway through everything shifts.
Yeah, both from like the like negotiation side of like we're taking this out, so we'll put this in, but also just that like the team's like we can do B and then they can't, and it's like every single sprint.
So I'll say on the one hand, props to your product owner for being flexible about that kind of thing. As new things come up, and respecting the team's estimate on that. That's great. I think that this is frankly an issue not with the product owner but with the team. I think that it's a great retro topic, first of all, to have with the team to talk about why do we keep overestimating our ability to do things. Why are we struggling so much to identify ahead of time that the work that we're trying to accomplish is not something we can accomplish within the course of a single sprint? And why are we failing our product owner and not providing useful information during refinement to make sure that they understand that these things are not of the size that we thought they were? Not knowing the situation specifically, there could be a bunch of one-off things that are sort of just happening at around the same time, and it's a death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of situation. But if there's something that you feel is systemic there, where your team is really optimistic about your ability to accomplish things, or maybe your team is not doing a good job of asking useful questions in the course of those refinement or planning meetings, then that's a great thing to talk about and with the team and say, okay, folks, how do we have better conversations around this? Because we keep running into the same problem and it keeps costing us things.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Best of luck. Is Robert Henley, are you waiting? Or are you just hovering there? You're also muted, for source.
Bill, I'll give you props for a great presentation. I was just getting close so I could comment nearby about Greg's question. The old sprint burn down chart, where you watched on a daily basis people's evolution of their how much time they thought they had left on each particular task they'd undertaken, was a great way to spot patterns like overcommitment, where you would need to descope a sprint in that manner. But really, I agree with you that the answer to the question is use the retrospective. This is a team issue, and talking it through with the team, how can we get better at initially estimating what do we need to groom the backlog more? Do we need to think about or have discussions during sprint planning that are better? But the retro is the place to bring that up and fix the issue, or at least try to propose solutions.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where we probably will need to try a couple things before we figure out a couple good approaches. And I think it's rarely the case where you'll find one thing and it'll magically solve all your problems. And on the sprint burn down, I think the burn down is a super helpful thing to use. It's something that I've used with teams before. Sometimes I'll put that in the review so they can see at the end, hey, here's how the burn down did over time. Here's how we did in terms of completing things as we went along. But it's also helpful, as you say, day to day to look in during a stand up and say, okay, after everyone's given their updates, here's where we are so far towards our ultimate goal. Are we on track? Are we not on track? How do we feel about that? And a good opportunity for people on the team to jump in and say, hey, seems like we might be falling behind. How can we help one another?
Yeah, the distinction one really has to make is between the product burn down and the sprint burn down, which are often conflated or not entirely distinguished.
Yeah, I find the product burn down to be generally useless.
And I've seen a lot of people simply ignore it because it's a pain to every day go, how much work have I got left? But it's useful for exactly this reason.
Yeah, I mean, there's a longer conversation here around how are you measuring the burn down. I tend not to be measuring in time because I don't think time is a particularly useful metric. I use story points using complexity that are fully team derived because I find that to be a little bit more consistent, especially over time. And so it's never going to be as perfect of okay, we thought we had 5 hours left and the sprint ends in 2 hours. But it still gives a good sense of because the trend line is always pretty clear of are we above the trend line or are we below the trend line? Okay. Any other questions that I can answer? Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it again. I will head off to the networking lounge, so feel free to bother me there. And if not, enjoy the rest of your time. Have a good one.